Thank you. Thanks, Zena. I'm delighted to be here with Tom and Stephen to speak to you today. As Zena mentioned, I'm the editor of the Weekend Australian newspaper, a position I've held since 2012. Before that, I was deputy editor of the Oz, National Chief of Staff, Sydney Bureau Chief, and Social Affairs editor for a few years. I've been a journalist for 28 years, almost all of it spent on the Oz, with the exception of a few months early in my career on the Daily Mirror and the Daily Telegraph, where I earned my stripes chasing police cars and ambulances on the midnight to dawn police rounds shift. That was a long time ago. They were very different times, and while I don't want to spend too long reminiscing on the 80s and 90s, it is instructive, I think, to dwell for a moment on the media environment of that time to demonstrate how different things are today. These were years when a journalism cadetship on a newspaper began with the job of a copy person. The 5 a.m. shift involved buying the police rounds reporter on the Mirror a can of Coke, a packet of Camel cigarettes, and a finger bun with strawberry icing, all to be consumed before 5:30. The reporter concerned had probably been at the nearby Journo's bar in Surrey Hills until closing time, which was 3 a.m. And that was his start to the day. The evening shift, and I remember this fondly, involved taking the papers from the presses downstairs in Holt Street over to the editors, who by that time were drinking at the Evening Star pub. And believe me, that was a task that required, if you were female in particular, a considerable degree of agility. So culturally, the newsroom of last century was a different universe. Even on the comparatively staid floor of the Australian, it was a blokey, smoke-filled environment. Cadet training involved drinking sessions at the pub every afternoon, and you very much learned your craft on the job. Now, of course, the number of entry-level journalism jobs in newspapers are very few, sadly. And the kids we have coming in are well into their 20s, have several degrees, speak several languages, and want to write an analysis piece on the evils of quantitative easing on their very first day, followed the next day by an analysis piece on China and the Spratlys. But the cultural changes are nothing compared to the changes in the nature of the work itself. Many of the mainstream players are the same. We still watch Four Corners. We listen to radio news in the car, and some of us even still buy newspapers, print newspapers, and watch the nightly television news. But obviously the proliferation of digital platforms has heralded a 24/7 news cycle in which traditional media companies and new players compete around the clock. Exclusives are never exclusive for long. News travels around the world in a matter of seconds, and media, brands and mastheads struggle to differentiate themselves in the face of content aggregators, including social media platforms, of course, such as Facebook. As you are all aware, these pressures, together with the collapse of the newspaper advertising market, are challenging the business model of many media companies, particularly newspaper publishers. And of course, all these changes have had an enormous impact on the practice of journalism itself and the relationships between journalists, politicians, and the public service. Much of the commentary surrounding these changes has been negative, and I do see some causes for alarm. One of the consequences of a 24/7 media cycle is a proliferation of shallow soundbite style journalism. When I started out, journalists typically wrote 1 or 2 news stories a day, but they had all day to research and write them before filing for the next day's edition. Journalists now compete to be the first to post breaking news on Twitter, often within seconds of something happening. Court reporters send tweets of the evidence from court. Journalists tweet links from inside, or leaks rather, from inside caucus meetings in real time. They then compete to post a story and get it up on their digital platform. And the mastheads then compete to have the best coverage with links embedded to video and tweets, the more the better, and to then be the first to post analysis or provocative commentary on that news story. Instead of filing 1 or 2 stories for the next day's paper, reporters are now filing constantly for online platforms as they simultaneously try and chase exclusive stories or angles for the next day's paper. Whereas once reporters had to be able to interview people and write, they are now required to often take photographs, do podcasts, record broadcast quality video, and promote their own stories on social media. Within minutes of something happening, as I said, anywhere in the world there are video grabs on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Anyone with a mobile phone becomes a recorder of news events, eyewitnesses who are able to instantly distribute their account of what they have seen. Journalists on the other side of the world can instantly access this content. Indeed, News Corporation has purchased a company, Storyful, whose job it is to verify the authenticity of posts like this and gain permission to publish them on mainstream media platforms across the world. We saw with the Orlando shooting recently that Australian media websites were very popular amongst Americans who were up in the middle of the night wanting to find out what had happened in that nightclub shooting at 2 a.m. in the morning. Because of the time difference, our coverage of that shooting in Australia was far superior than contracting American newsrooms were able to do in real time, because it was the middle of the night there. One significant consequence of all of these changes is that governments, police forces, and other authorities now have no way of controlling the information flow from these events. Take, for example, the recent coup in Turkey. As Erdogan was reassuring reporters from traditional news agencies that there was nothing to see and that the coup had been short-lived and was under control, images on YouTube being accessed on mobile phones around the world were telling a vastly different story. They showed the parliament being attacked and protesters being fired upon from military helicopters. I was on the phone to our digital desk on that day. It was a Saturday morning and I was taking my children to school sport. I was pushing the editor of our site to move to a running blog because events that are unfolding so quickly are best suited to a blog style rather than a static normal story template. My 14-year-old son, who was in the back seat of the car and was interested in my conversation, he was accessing video and images on his mobile in the back seat and was getting information faster than the digital editor in the office 40 years his senior. What my son couldn't do, of course, was make sense of this vision or be sure of its authenticity. You need journalists for that. And this is why I'm nonplussed by the hype talk of citizen bloggers and citizen journalists. As the digital age evolves, we are fast learning to value information from sources that we can trust. We are also seeking out more than a headline or the sugar hit of a BuzzFeed list. Increasingly, discerning media consumers will seek out and be prepared to pay for media outlets that reflect their values and offer them deep engagement in the issues of the day. Advertisers too, and I say this with my fingers and toes crossed, will hopefully realise that deep engagement with a digital story, which will see someone reading it for 10 minutes or more, is worth so much more than the inventory around snack and grab news sites, where eyeballs are on the screen so fleetingly for just a matter of moments. But back to the journalism. My colleague Paul Kelly has regularly argued or bemoaned that another consequence of 24/7 is a dumbing down of public policy discussion. One consequence of the voracious hunger for news, I think, is a dumbing down of quality and a tendency to give everything equal value. For example, a backbencher can now go onto the Sky News channel and have a whinge about some policy or other or his leader. And that story is elevated to a status and given an attention that it once would never have attracted. The fact is, all stories do not have equal weight, and we need experienced journalists and editors to sift through the sound and fury in search of matters of real political or policy importance. This is a point Paul Kelly has made most recently about the federal election campaign, where there was very little coverage of budget deficit or debt, no talk of the need for economic reform to save the nation's living standards, and scant debate about a nation living beyond its means. On The Australian, we tried to explore these issues, but in the broader debate, they rarely rated a mention. In his outstanding book, Triumph and Demise, Paul has written of a crisis in the nation's political culture. Kelly sees voter distrust, the rise of dangerous currents of populism, the triumph of sectional interests and identity politics, the dominance of negative campaigns, and media fragmentation as all part of an unseemly and worrying trend. He writes at length in the book about the failure of Kevin Rudd's prime ministership and attributes it in part to his failure to deal with the new media landscape. Rudd's quest, and I quote, for control coincided with the decay of the established media apparatus. He was caught between two worlds, desperate as Prime Minister to control media coverage and events around him, yet perpetually frustrated because complete control was unachievable. As Kelly said, the days when Paul Keating as Treasurer could brief 5 senior journalists, confident his message would be transmitted around the nation, were gone. That world no longer existed. Obviously, the compressed news cycle is particularly challenging for our political leaders. The speed with which Malcolm Turnbull called a royal commission into the juvenile justice system in the Northern Territory last week, less than 12 hours after the screening of the Four Corners program on the subject, is a case in point. There was clear political virtue in being seen to respond so quickly and decisively. However, we have seen in ensuing days legitimate questions asked about whether a royal commission was the right way to go, particularly when it emerged that the issues had been ventilated to some extent in Northern Territory commissioned reports. There was more unravelling on Monday when the man appointed so swiftly to head it decided to stand aside in the face of criticisms and claims of conflict of interest. And yet more questions are being posed today about whether one of the replacement commissioners is compromised because of comments he made on the very first day after the story broke, before he was given the gig. On the one hand, national focus has been brought to an important area, but the attendant circus must leave many shaking their heads in despair. Which brings me to my final point. The most important advice ever given to me about newspaper editing was to stop and give yourself time to think. The mornings of a newspaper editor are intense. My Fridays mornings go something like this. Wake, reach for the phone, check the emails that have come in overnight, often from the correspondents, and check the Australian's mobile site. Reach for the iPad, check the app, make sure it's fine. Quickly scan domestic and overseas news sites. The Courier Mail, the Herald Sun, the Age, the West, Australian, the Northern Territory News, as well as the Wall Street Journal, the Times, and Twitter. Then I sit down at 7:45, listen to ABC News while reading the print editions of the SMH, the Fin, the Telegraph and the Oz. Listen to AM, then switch over to commercial radio to get a different perspective. Briefly listen to Alan Jones and Ray Headley. That's it in a nutshell. I could then make calls to the digital desk to check on updates to some of our stories, reorder the position of the site if that's needed, and get early morning stuff moving on the yarns of the day. Of course, the day ends at about 11 o'clock when I'm speaking to the night editor about changes I want made for the final edition of the paper. It is information overload, and it is also very easy to get caught up and carried along with the tide. But the Australian has never seen itself as a paper of record, existing merely to parrot the what, where, when and how of the day. For much of our history, we have been a second buy alongside a city-based paper. And so our success was dependent on having news stories that our competitors didn't have. This continues today. The Oz is often ridiculed by Crikey and others for the number of red exclusive tags we put on our stories. But in this world, there is no future in offering the same diet as our competitors, especially when some of those competitors, such as public broadcasters, don't have a paywall. So as editors and journalists, we must take ourselves out of the fray, to think about where to take stories, to unpick the logic of government announcements and judge them against the national interest, and most importantly, to come up with ideas. And while I have no experience as a public servant, I suppose that is the challenge for many of you as well. How to be responsive to events and agile in dealing with the latest crisis or issue, but leaving yourselves with capacity to think strategically and pursue medium-term to long-term objectives. Stephen is, I believe, going to be far more useful to you in a few moments on this issue, relating it directly to strategies you can all employ to deal with hypermedia and hypergovernment. From my perspective, good ideas are central. They fuel the investigative journalism which is critical to healthy, properly functioning democracies. I had cause to reflect on this recently when I chaired a session on investigative journalism with Kate McClymont from the Sydney Morning Herald and David Bairstow from the New York Times at a conference to mark the 40th anniversary of the Press Council. The topic was, is investigative journalism an expensive luxury or a necessity? Obviously, the three of us were in furious agreement in answer to that question. You see, for those of you concerned about the rise in populism in the US and Europe, and to a lesser extent here in Australia with the persistent attraction of fringe parties, such as those fronted by Pauline Hanson and Clive Palmer, the future of investigative journalism is critical. And it is traditional media outlets prepared to fund expensive, old-school reporting by journalists who are your greatest allies. Consider for a moment Hedley Thomas's pursuit of Clive Palmer, the former federal member for the Sunshine Coast seat of Fairfax. Palmer was a man who used his money to buy his lower house seat and 3 seats in the Senate, almost without scrutiny. The Australian's editor-in-chief at the time, Chris Mitchell, became aware that Palmer was furious with the Queensland LNP, to which he had been a large donor, for not complying with his wishes over the development of the Galilee Basin. Chris asked Hedley to have a look, and the more we looked, the more we found. Palmer claimed he was a billionaire. We found his Yabaloo nickel refinery to be in severe financial trouble. He claimed to be building a replica of the Titanic. We visited the Chinese shipyard where it was supposedly being built and found nothing. Hedley investigated his dealings with Chinese iron ore company CITIC and found he had used their funds to prop up election advertising. We went to the Coolum Resort, which he owned, and found he had run it into the ground. Palmer tried to sue the newspaper, of course, over this series of reporting that went on for quite some time, years in fact, and made a series of attacks on Hedley and Rupert Murdoch. But the facts were there for all to see, and eventually even the ABC had to take notice. The important thing here is not to rely, I think, on demonising candidates such as Palmer in a shrill ideological debate, but calmly and methodically revealing the truth about them and their policy positions, etc. It is much cheaper and easier, of course, to fire up your commentators and let rip along party political or ideological lines. But this approach fails because in the case of populist outsiders, it merely strengthens their hand. In his essay exploring some of the themes of this conference, John Wanner writes, "The attention span of executive government has considerably shortened as the 24/7 media cycle has become more pronounced, insatiable for copy, but also more combative, adversarial, and contrarian. Political actors are expending tremendous energy on media tactics and rival positioning, critiquing and discrediting opponents, rather than providing vision, comprehending important trends, scoping emerging opportunities, rationing scarce resources, or dealing with budget problems." He is absolutely correct, and the result is policy failure of the kind we saw arguably with the Rudd government's home insulation scheme, or the wasteful Building the Education Revolution stimulus package, or the mining resources tax. In my address today, I've sought to acknowledge that the changing face of media has helped create the environment where these debacles are more likely. But I've also sought to argue that serious, high-quality journalism is an essential part of the solution. These public policy failures just mentioned were all pursued vigorously by The Australian. For a long time, we were chasing them on our own. We took a similar approach to the Australian wheat board scandal during the Howard years, and more recently, the continuing problems with the vocational education sector in the Abbott-Turnbull years. If a Fairfax editor were standing here, they would speak with equal passion and pride about the outstanding work of Kate McClymont or Adele Ferguson or Baker and McKenzie. Yes, we are living in a hyper-media, hyper-government world, and there is no turning back. the disruption to our industry has been and is traumatic. But after 28 years in journalism, I believe there has never been a more exciting time to be a broadsheet newspaper editor. We're engaging with our readers in a more meaningful way than ever before. The tools at our disposal to enhance our storytelling are phenomenal, and the importance of a free press has never been greater. We have more than 80,000 digital subscribers on the Oz, and this is growing. Even the print circulation for the Weekend Australian has started to plateau at about 225,000 copies every weekend. That's 600,000 readers. Some weeks we're selling more papers than at the same time last year. And last month, when news of Brexit broke on a Friday, we saw a circulation spike of 9,000 copies. That tells me that people are still looking to serious quality journalism to help them make sense of the world. Call me naive, but when I read the words written on the very first front page of The Australian 52 years ago, which was produced from Canberra, Tom, you're quite right, inviting the thinking men and women of Australia to join us in a company of progress, I cannot help think that when it comes to the most important things, not all that much has changed. Thank you. Thank you.